It was a day hailed by the government as the start of peace in Venezuela. A vote to elect a new constituent assembly that will rewrite the country's constitution after months of unrest. But this was the deadliest day of clashes since protests against President Nicolás Maduro began 4 months ago. The opposition called for Venezuelans to take to the streets and say 12 people were killed. They see the vote as an illegal move to dissolve the National Assembly controlled by anti-Maduro parties. But the vote went ahead, and Maduro claimed victory.
Es la votación más grande que haya sacado la revolución bolivariana en toda la historia electoral de 18 años.
According to Venezuelan law, a constituent assembly can be elected to rewrite the constitution. Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, held a similar vote in 1999, which led to changes like allowing presidential re-election and a new name for the country. But Chavez called a referendum first, asking Venezuelans if they supported the reforms, a step Maduro has skipped. What makes this vote even more controversial is that the opposition boycotted it, meaning all 5,500 candidates were pro-government. Maduro's critics also say the more than 8 million votes claimed by Venezuela's election authority were in fact closer to 2.5 million.
No reconocemos ese proceso fraudulento. Para nosotros es nulo, no existe.
Opposition leaders say Maduro's grip on power is now sealed, and fear targeted persecution. On Monday night, 2 politicians under house arrest were reportedly taken from their homes by Venezuelan intelligence. A chorus of international critics have condemned the vote, including some of Venezuela's former regional allies.
None of these suggested constitutional changes from this constituent assembly will be neither accepted nor recognized.
Maduro is not just a bad leader, he is now a dictator.
The U.S. went further, slapping new sanctions against President Nicolás Maduro. But the question everyone is asking is whether the Trump administration is prepared to hit Venezuela where it hurts most by stopping the import of its oil. America is Venezuela's biggest crude oil buyer, and it's the country's only source of revenue left as the economy plunges into chaos. But will further moves against the Venezuelan government make life worse for ordinary people and radicalize Maduro's politics?
Mr. Imperator Donald Trump.
Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Ana Quintana. She's a Latin America and Western Hemisphere policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And from London is Javier Faje, journalist and Latin America analyst. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. And many world leaders are saying that this vote in Venezuela, it marks the end of democracy. But President Maduro says it was a vote, people voted freely, and he won.
The vote was a completely undemocratic and highly fraudulent process. It was 545 candidates who were hand-selected by Maduro, by the ruling Socialist Party, to take control. And they will now rewrite the Constitution, get rid of the National Assembly, the democratically elected National Assembly. And this is going to be the same type of consolidation of power that we saw occur in Cuba after the Communist Revolution.
And one immediate thing that's happened, which has caused a lot of worry, is that 2 opposition leaders have been arrested. Their families say their whereabouts are unknown. Do you think that that could be a sign of things to come?
I think things are undoubtedly going to get worse. The fact that Antonio Ledesma and Leopoldo Lopez were taken from their homes at around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, with no warning, with nothing. They were arbitrarily arrested. I mean, it's a sign of things to come, and it's definitely a sign that the Venezuelan government is exceptionally desperate, and whatever legitimacy they knew that they thought that they had, they've lost it. And I definitely think the repression against the opposition is only going to get worse.
Javier, let me come to you, because you were shaking your head when Ana was saying that this was an undemocratic process. But let me put this to you. There were no independent observers monitoring that vote, and there was no option for people to vote against it. So how is it a fair representation of what the Venezuelan people wanted?
these votes have been audited, and anyone can go to the Electoral Commission and check and verify that these votes were actually legitimate. Anyone can do that. Your correspondent in Caracas can do that. And I don't know what on what planet she's living, because this is absolute and utter nonsense. According to Article 348 of the Constitution, the President had the right to call a Constituent Assembly. Furthermore, the National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, could have done that, and they decided not to do it because they couldn't agree among themselves. They had the right to call a Constituent Assembly. I will go even further than that. But since 2013, leaders of the opposition like Freddy Guevara, Maria Corina Machado, have been asking for a Constituent Assembly. Why didn't they call one themselves? This
well,
is Article
the opposition
that I love. Hold on a second.
Javier, the opposition are saying that only the turnout was just 15%. So less than 2 million people voted for this.
And what evidence do they have that that's the case? You see, these votes have been audited. Anyone can go to the Electoral Commission and ask for the verification of these votes. If you don't want to do it, if nobody wants to do it, that is not the problem of the Venezuelan government. They don't want to believe. Furthermore, they said that 7 million people voted in this so-called plebiscite that they called a few weeks ago. Again, there was no way to verify. Do we have to believe that these 7 million voted, but only 12 million people voted in a verifiable election? This is an absolute nonsense. The President was entitled to call to this Constituent Assembly. And furthermore, there's 9 objectives which are going to be discussed in the Constituent Assembly. None of them talks about extending the power of the President or extending his term in office. None of them. They deal with post-oil economy, to the institutionalization of the misiones, fighting climate change, elements related to the judiciary. None of them talks about, they're not going to discuss the extending the powers of President Maduro.
Anna, let me put that to Anna.
So please.
Javier is saying that this Constituent Assembly doesn't extend the powers of President Maduro. Obviously, that is the big criticism that has been levelled at him.
It's not just a criticism. It's what Javier is spewing is Venezuelan government propaganda. So the Constituent Assembly was a completely undemocratic process. The opposition at no point had a time to go and through and hold their own Constituent Assembly because the National Electoral Council is controlled by the Venezuelan government. It's controlled completely by Maduro. They are hand-picked appointees by the Venezuelan government. On July 16th, as much, then the opposition held their own vote. Civil society groups all throughout Venezuela and throughout the rest of the world, the Venezuelan expatriates voted. And you know what? 7.6 million Venezuelans strongly voted condemning Maduro. This is 7.6 million Venezuelans, much more than the 2.5 who voted during the Constituent Assembly vote.
Okay,
so facts are facts, and the numbers are incredibly clear, and they can be reinforced by numerous civil society groups.
That's absolutely nonsense.
Why is that nonsense, Javier? I think that
because
why do you discredit the results of one vote and not the other?
You ask me a question. Let me answer it. You can verify how many people voted during the vote for the Constituent Assembly. You cannot verify that 7 million people voted because there was no way to do that. That's the difference. Second, assuming that 7 million people voted in that plebiscite, let's assume that, although we know that many people voted more than once, but let's give the opposition these 7 million votes. It's slightly more than 35% of the electorate. Furthermore, it's slightly more than the people that voted for the candidate of the opposition in the elections in 2013.
President Maduro's supporters are saying even at the higher end of the turnout estimate, which is something like 41%, that's still not much of a mandate, is it? If there really was just 41% turnout.
Well, if you knew how elections happen in Venezuela from 1999 onwards, the levels of abstention have always been very high in Venezuela, always been very high. Furthermore, President Maduro won the election in 2013 with 7 million votes. So no, I'm sorry, but let's
move away from the mechanics of the election and talk about what the consequences have been. The US has imposed sanctions on Venezuelans targeting 13 high-ranking officials, and immediately after that vote, it froze US assets held by President Maduro. Anna, does this go far enough?
I think they need to go further. If things continue the way that they're going, if Venezuela continues to show a disregard for the democratic norms that every single country in Latin America has agreed to, that every single country in Latin America since the year 2001 has abided by, then yes, the U.S. government does need to penalize them. And it's not just the U.S. government alone. Just last week, the 13 Venezuelan government officials that were sanctioned, there were also reciprocal sanctions by Colombia, by Panama, and by Paraguay, if I'm not mistaken. That's a strong statement. And also, I mean, Javier, I'm very sorry, and you and I can go back and forth on the numbers of who voted and what can be verified and what can't. But you know what can be verified?
You mentioned
that on Sunday alone, in 24 hours, 16, let me finish. Okay, that's fine. And I know I started with the numbers, and I'll continue with the numbers. Okay, that's great. But the most important number that should be remembered is in 24 hours, 16 innocent, let me finish, please, because I let you speak, and now you're going to let me speak. 16 innocent Venezuelans were killed by the Venezuelan government in 24 hours alone. In the 4 months that the protests have been going on, 121 protesters have been killed. They have been killed by active live fire. The Venezuelan government is shooting kids dead in the street. The Venezuelan government has armed tanks going after protesters. And that's a number that cannot be disputed and cannot be lied by, and that cannot be lied. And I would love to see how you can justify that.
Just picking up on that point, Javier, but it is the case. It is the case that opposition leaders, two prominent opposition leaders, have been arrested, and President Maduro has threatened, has promised that more opposition leaders will be prosecuted. So clearly, from now on, we're going to see a bigger crackdown on protesters.
Hang a second. Let's go back to the dead people who died. Are you including, Anna, those Chavistas who were set on fire by opposition gangs? No, you are not, are you? Because you claim that all the people were killed by the army or by the police. You have not included the candidates that were killed during the election for the Constituent Assembly, pro-Chavez candidates. Of course, you are not including that. You are saying the 100 people were killed by the army. You know that is not true. You are actually manipulating deliberately. You are being extremely dishonest by putting all the dead people in the hands of the government. You know that is not the case. There's many videos that I invite your viewers to go and check how these Chavistas were set on fire by gangs from the opposition and died of the injuries. So please, let's stop talking about all the people were killed by them. Going back to the sanctions, they were rearrested. I don't really know, to be honest with you, I don't know more details than anybody does about the arrest of Ledesma and Lopez. They were rearrested. They were arrested. They were on house arrest, and they were rearrested by the intelligence services. We haven't heard the reasons why. But I would like to remind you that Leopoldo Lopez from prison sent videos asking the army to intervene. That is absolutely wrong, because that exacerbates a situation of violence in Venezuela.
Can we agree there are clearly massive divisions within Venezuela over this? Even some government loyalists, former staunch supporters of President Maduro, are now saying that this is wrong. His Attorney General saying that Venezuela is now dictatorial. Let's have a listen to what Luisa Ortega Diaz said immediately after the vote.
And I address the country by categorical imperative and by the mandate of the Constitution and the law to disregard. Listen closely. To disregard the origin, process, and result of the immoral Presidential Constituent Assembly.
Javier, she's asking the country to disregard what she calls an immoral Constituent Assembly.
This is the same Attorney General who, out of the 2,500 people who have been indicted for acts of violence, only 200 have been prosecuted. She has not done her job. This is the same one that justified the arrest of Leopoldo Lopez, who's being rearrested now. But at the same time, she doesn't seem to realize that the Constitution, seems to forget that the Constitution of Venezuela allows not only the President but the National Assembly to call for a Constituent Assembly. This is in the actual Constitution. It was not a decree that came out of the blue. This is so she's actually not that. She hasn't done her job. Not long ago, she gave an interview in radio saying that she would not prosecute people who have committed violence because that wouldn't serve any purpose. Basically saying she's given impunity to violent gangs to go and cause mayhem in Venezuela. So I'm sorry, but I don't recognize any moral authority in this woman.
Okay. Anna, going back to the issue of sanctions, we were talking about what the US has done, and you were saying they don't go far enough. One option that Mr. Trump, President Trump, could be thinking about is imposing sanctions on the oil industry. Now, that is pretty much a nuclear option, because that would further damage an economy that's already in freefall.
So I think an all-right oil embargo, I mean, that is definitely on the table. But prior to that, there are so many other steps that can and should be taken, and I'm quite glad that they are under consideration. Whether it's limiting the amount of oil that the United States processes from Venezuela. Javier, I'm speaking, and I never interrupted you, so please allow me to speak. The United States currently processes about 30% of Venezuela's crude oil production. That's 70,000 barrels, 70,000 barrels per day. That's something that could potentially be scaled back unless the Venezuelan government decides to respect the will of the Venezuelan people. And speaking on sanctions and the efficacy of sanctions and just how well-intentioned they are. So just early in the Trump administration, the president sanctioned the vice president of Venezuela, Tariq al-Assami, and froze his assets in the United States pursuant to the U.S. Drug Kingpin Act, because it is very well known that the vice president of Venezuela is a significant drug trafficker. To date, close to over $500 million in illicit finances and assets were located inside of the U.S. jurisdiction. That is significant. That $500 million can go an extremely long way in the future of Venezuela when there is a democratic transition and to rebuild the country. He is only one person. Imagine the rest of the money.
In terms of regional support as well, a few countries have supported President Maduro. Other countries have not. Colombia, Argentina, Mexico. Could Venezuela find itself isolated in the region?
I think Venezuela is finding themselves incredibly isolated. So it's been Argentina, Brazil, Colombia. I think they're speaking to me. It's been Argentina, Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Mexico, the UK, the European Parliament, and Spain as well. So this is not just a regional issue. It's recognized that this is an international issue.
Let me put that to Javier.
Mercosur is now considering getting rid of Venezuela.
How much of a problem is it that Venezuela might now or is finding itself isolated because of its plans to rewrite the constitution? How much does this worry President Maduro?
But first of all, let me clarify. The southern Gulf of Mexico refineries depend heavily on heavy crude from Venezuela. The U.S. cannot afford to impose an embargo on Venezuela's exports of oil. You can go to Texas, to the Ocean, Texas, the refinery, they will tell you that they cannot afford not to have Venezuelan oil. That's why President Trump has not gone that far. Let's just start there. Second, in relation to isolation, they still have this. Colombia is the biggest ally of the U.S. in South America. Argentina has been extremely hostile to Venezuela from the moment President Macri took office. The president of Brazil is under investigation for alleged cases of corruption. I doubt that he has any moral authority to disavow, the government in Venezuela. Again, there are other countries that still support the Venezuelan government. Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua. Yes, I know you're going to say, yes, they are left-wing governments, but there's not everybody in the region who are against Venezuela. So yes, some
radical left-wing governments
are supporting the
guys,
boycott.
We're running out of time, so I just want to ask one more question of both of you. Aside from sanctions and isolation, what about dialogue? Can we encourage dialogue? Would that be a way out of this? Very quick answer from each of you. Anna?
I definitely agree that there should be a dialogue. I think a dialogue is the proper way to mediate out of this situation, but I think there should be very strict conditions on this dialogue. There should be the unconditional release of political prisoners, the unconditional guarantee that there will be no violence against political prisoners. I think there also needs to be the unconditional guarantee that illicit assets that were stolen from the Venezuelan people by the Venezuelan government have got to be returned. These are just a number of the conditions that have got to be in place for there to be a successful dialogue.
How do we bring stability back to Venezuela? Very quickly.
Well, I think the dialogue, I agree with Anna in that respect, that there should be a dialogue, but only a few hours ago, the wife of Antonio Ledesma, Missy Caprilli, said that she didn't like the dialogue, and there was a video broadcast by Mr. Ledesma saying that the dialogue had failed and he doesn't want any kind of dialogue. I'm afraid that some people in the opposition do not want a dialogue, but dialogue is the only solution for the problem. I agree with Anna in that respect.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Ana Quintana and Javier Fahey. Thank you.